Previously, on Mass Effect 3, we saved the Citadel Council from a coup. Today, I'd like to catch up on a few general things. The Citadel coup is the halfway point of the game, and there's a changeover in hub content. Presidium scenery is changed to show battle damage, there are more refugees and guards about, some old quests become unavailable, and new quests will appear on the map to replace them.
Shepard, what the hell are you doing down here with the grunts?
One of the things I'd like to look at today is James Vega. Right at the beginning of the very first video in this playthrough, I described Vega as a surrogate for newcomers to the series. He's the new guy that can ask silly questions like, what's a Krogan, and who are these Reaper guys anyway? Thing is, that description, the question character, does a disservice to James Vega as he's actually written. It's a little too reductive, really. Anyway, this sequence is what happens the first time you talk to Vega on the Normandy, and it actually changes depending on when you trigger it. You can trigger it before you start the Genophage arc, or you can wait until later, much later in fact. And if you wait long enough, Vega is actually really hostile to Shepard, assuming that Shepard is arrogant and snobbish.
Okay, Loco, let's dance.
Don't push your luck, Vega. With age comes wisdom. And rank.
So you get this scene with Vega where he tells you his background while sparring with Shepard. It's a nice scene, a bit more engaging than the two characters just standing and talking at one another. It really shows off Vega's physicality. This isn't a character that can sit still and listen. He's not very contemplative. He wants to be doing something all the time. That said, I don't like it. Vega's backstory is kind of circuitous and maybe too detailed to be explained over fisticuffs. The music is also too dramatic, and potentially you can experience this conversation right at the beginning of the game. While we're still processing the fall of Earth and what this galactic apocalypse might mean, we suddenly get this exposition dump all about this character who we don't even know yet. It reminds me a little of Bishop at the end of Neverwinter Nights 2, and how he reveals his long, complicated, hidden life story to you, just as you're about to finally confront the main villain at the climax of the game. It's just the wrong time to do it.
I do.
You a shrink too?
Nope. But that stunt back on Mars was reckless. You're lucky to be alive.
So?
So? Maybe you don't care if you live or die.
Or maybe... I'm just willing to do whatever the fuck it takes to end this goddamn war.
Maybe you are. But if you're half as good as I think you are, we need you alive.
Thanks for the pep talk.
Anytime.
Hey, thanks for the dance, Loco.
Loco, huh?
I can think of worse things to call you.
I'm sad to say that it actually coloured my perceptions of Vega on my first playthrough. Which is a shame because, again, there's more to Vega than readily apparent. I like how decidedly proletarian Vega is, with his constant reference to the officer-soldier divide. He doesn't faff around with meditation or comic opera. He likes drinking and exercising and using his body. It's funny because, as a lieutenant, Vega is a commissioned officer, just like Shepard. Maybe it's a reference to Star Trek and how Chief Miles O'Brien is the only non-commissioned officer in the entire galaxy. It's worth comparing Vega to his closest equivalents in the cast, Ashley and Grunt, the two other soldiers. Although Ashley was technically subordinate to Vega, I think anyway, the Mass Effect ranks aren't exactly consistent. It was always used to contrast against her true personality as an officer, the descendant of generals, unfairly blacklisted by the military elite. and in the end, she's vindicated by becoming the second human Spectre. Briefly. Grunt, meanwhile, is Krogan royalty. Despite his name, he's an officer in the old aristocratic tradition, superior by birth to the common, non-perfect Krogan. Of these three, Vega is the only one who embraces his working-class identity, and you can see it in his attitude. In these two scenes with Vega, he's got this very subtle edge to his interactions with Shepard. There's no deference or respect due to a superior officer or a galactic hero. In fact, Vega pokes and prods Shepard, brawling with them in the shuttle bay or setting them up for faux pas with Marine chants. I mean, don't get me wrong, they get along, they're friends or at least friendly, but there's still a little tension between the two, and I think that's great. It makes the eventual turnaround much better.
Shepard, glad you came.
What'd you have in mind?
Something that doesn't involve fighting Reapers.
That's hard to find these days. I suppose we could catch a Hanar poetry reading.
No offense, but if the end of the galaxy is coming, I'm not going out on the phrase, "This one feels like a flower."
So?
So, I had an idea.
Where are we going?
Somewhere we're not supposed to.
Some things never change, do they?
Ever have that one thing you always wanted to do before you died, Shepard?
Too busy trying to live. What's yours?
The whole time I worked at CSEC, I'd stare up at the top of the Presidium and say to myself, I want to go up there. But I never did. There were 137 regulations telling me I couldn't.
So you got them changed?
No. Now I just don't give a damn. Figured it's time to do something stupid just for the hell of it. Might be the last chance we ever get.
Garrus, of course, has a very different relationship with Shepard. They've legitimately been friends for a long time. They've known each other since the very first game, and by they, I mean both Shepard and the player. In a way, it's the opposite of what you get with Vega. There's this surface level of taunts and banter, but that just hides a deep and abiding friendship. As I've said before, Garrus isn't a threatening figure. He's solid, dependable, always, definitely on your side. If you choose to sabotage a genophage, you can actually tell Garrus about it, and he'll stand by your decision no matter what, even if you murdered Mordin or Paddock Wicks to protect your secret. Here, though, we get a scene where, for once, we see Shepard and Garrus on an off day. No apartment sieges, no suicide missions, just two friends chilling out and having fun together. Again, it's a nice change of pace from the usual conversation setting. What I want to look at here, though, isn't Garrus himself, but BioWare's writing. Now, I've usually held to the opinion that BioWare is better at writing comedy than it is the serious stuff. I think, in general, humour is often easier to write. Humour, of course, isn't the same as jokes, which have structure and demand a balance between setup and payoff. But I think it's easier in general to get a laugh than it is to intentionally evoke sadness or anger or pity. Certainly for BioWare anyway. And if you ask people what their favourite BioWare characters are, you'll almost always get the funny characters come up most. Jon Jonsson, Minsk and Boo, HK-47, Garrus. The other characters tend, I think, to be less popular outside of their associated fan bases. Now, this isn't necessarily to say that BioWare is good at writing comedy, although I think Jon Jonsson is actually properly hilarious. But, well, have a look at this line, for instance.
I'm Garrus Vakarian, and this is now my favorite spot on the Citadel.
Right.
It's windy up here.
I don't like this line, and here's why. It references the Mass Effect 2 line, I'm Commander Shepard and this is my favourite store on the Citadel. And that's a funny line, because in Mass Effect 2, a Paragon Shepard could record endorsements for every store on the Citadel. and walking around you'd be bombarded with contradictory recordings, each proclaiming a different shop to be Shepard's favourite. It's absurd, and it underlines the disconnect between Paragon intentions, being morally upstanding and honest, and Paragon reality, the player filling up the character's blue bar. And I think that's funny. What isn't funny is simply dumping that line on the player and asking them to laugh, not because there's a joke or an amusing situation, but because it's a familiar line that was funny in another context. It's the same sort of thing as the constant references to Garrus making calibrations in Mass Effect 3. Garrus will mention it, the Turian Primarch will mention it, Legion will mention it. Again, it's this scary movie kind of humour, where there's no joke, no actual humorous information conveyed. Instead, it simply reminds the audience of a thing they know, and this is intended to get a laugh. Except, in that case, it's worse, of course, because the joke about Garrus constantly calibrating guns was an audience joke at BioWare's expense. That is, at how BioWare didn't include enough dialogue for a favourite character. They can't even do it just the once, it's referenced several times over and threatens to overshadow the actual arc about Garrus coming to terms with the ruthless calculus of war. I mean, right now you can probably remember the moments when Garrus referenced calibrations, but I doubt you recall the involvement he has with the Turian Primarch after Monet. Mass Effect 3 is, in a lot of ways, intended to be quite self-referential, but these callbacks to old jokes like Garrus's calibrations, or Blasto, or Conrad Werner can be exhausting, especially when BioWare ignores the original context for the sake of forcing in another joke, or insists on stretching the joke out as far as it can go. It's empty space, words without meaning, and how can that be funny? How can that be anything? Okay, so from comedy to, well, a different kind of comedy. Steve Cortez, our shuttle pilot, is now the official designated romantic interest for this playthrough. BioWare romances have a bit of a reputation. As I've mentioned before, for some they're the main draw, for others they're worthy only of mockery. I tend to fall into the second camp myself. But, first, let's focus on the good. Mass Effect 3 marks the first game in the series where gay and lesbian players can play a gay or lesbian Shepard. Okay, now let's move on to the bad. The Cortez romance subplot feels quite similar to the Jaheira romance in Baldur's Gate 2. In both games, the main character comforts the, well, for lack of a better word, target, who has just suffered the loss of their partner. Over time, that shoulder to cry on becomes a little bit more. It's something that's rightfully criticised as somewhat tasteless. Hitting on someone that is still grieving over a lost loved one is tacky in the extreme. Of course, so are most of the romances in Mass Effect. Within the text, Shepard is the commanding officer of most of these characters, or at the very least a mentor figure. Any subsequent romance is an abuse of that relationship. It's very noticeable in Mass Effect 2, specifically with Jacob and Garrus. Many players have commented on how uncomfortable they felt with Jennifer Hale's over-flirty readings of basic interaction dialogue with Jacob. And in the Garrus romance, it's very much definitely Shepard's idea. Garrus is almost reluctant at first. Obviously it's not inherently bad, there's lots of dramatic tension in a forbidden relationship, but that's largely ignored by BioWare, save for jokes about the prize.
What about your waking hours? Any R&R?
I need to keep myself busy. Otherwise, well, too much time to think.
I appreciate your dedication.
It's more than just what's written, though. Because of the nature of the medium, all romances are initiated and controlled by the player. The player decides when a romance is begun, continued, and ended. It's not just Shepard that has all the power in this unequal relationship, but the player. And there isn't really a way around this. Healthy relationships are the coming together of two separate, equally important individuals, and you just can't have that with a static fictional character. Cortez will never be able to turn around and tell us no, and if you think about it, that's really creepy.
Take some time off on the Citadel, Steve. As a favor to me.
I find it very hard to say no to you, Shepard.
As it should be. You finally made it off the Normandy.
Glad I did. Even with the chaos of all the refugees, seeing so many ships in flight is comforting. Gets me thinking. Hey, a Turian frigate. I think that's the PFS Havenkaw.
What's one Turian warship doing at the Citadel?
Looking for dry dock, I bet. She's seen battle. Look at the waiver in her drive corps missions. Alone, limping, looking for a haven. Maybe it would have been better to just go down fighting, like their families back home.
Are you talking about the Turians or yourself?
I should have been there. With Robert.
I'm glad you weren't. You'd be dead, and we'd never have met.
Yeah. That's the one good thing from all this. I'm glad to serve with you, Shepard.
The lives of future generations rest on those Turians' shoulders. On our shoulders. Nobody is giving up. Not those Turians, not me, not you.
If anyone can pull this all together, it's you.
Is that an Alliance cruiser? What's it doing here?
That's the SSV London. Decommissioned years ago. Look, no guns. Refugees must have salvaged her from a shipyard. Geneva-class cruisers always had eezo cores like granite.
People find a way to survive.
Do whatever it takes to see another day. Gotta let go. For real this time. The refugees here have put up a memorial wall. They leave mementos of lost loved ones. I was thinking maybe...
What's stopping you?
Nothing. I mean... Let me think about it.
Commander Shepard, it's been far too long. We live in interesting times.
A little too interesting.
I've mentioned before that most of the cast of Mass Effect 2 get their own spotlight moment. Miranda's doesn't really come up until towards the end of the game, but she makes a couple of appearances on the Citadel beforehand. When we first met Miranda, she was loyal to Cerberus through and through, despite the terrible things they'd done. By the end of the game though, she'd changed her mind and quit the paramilitary organisation for good. It's a curious arc because, if I remember right, it's not really obvious in Mass Effect 2 that she's losing faith in Cerberus. One of the interactions you can have after her loyalty mission is the confrontation with Jack, in which Miranda is still defending Cerberus contrary to all common sense. There's no real aha moment, no turning point where Miranda realises that Cerberus are the bad guys. At best you get a scene right at the end of the suicide mission where, if Shepard chooses to blow up the base and if Miranda is present, the elusive man will order her to stop Shepard, and she'll say, "No, consider this my resignation." But the arc is still there. It's, again, like Vega, kind of subtle. Miranda's big thing is that she's the perfect woman, genetically engineered to be the smartest, greatest and most beautiful person in the room. So, of course, most of her dialogues with Shepard involve her coming to terms with the fact that perfect genetics don't actually make you a perfect person. She's actually almost jealous of Shepard for their easy charisma and strength of character. This perfect woman, after all, with all her strengths, was only good enough to resurrect the real hero so that Shepard can complete the suicide mission. The emotional core of her loyalty mission isn't saving her sister from her father's mercenaries. It's her realization that her judgment isn't perfect, that her friend, Niket, might not be as blindly loyal to her as she assumed, and that he might actually have a different viewpoint, and that viewpoint might actually be more correct than hers. Earlier in the thread, somebody described Shepard as being an essentially rather flat character. They don't really change much over the course of the series, particularly through Mass Effect 2 and 3. I think it's worthwhile to look back at the Mass Effect 2 intro I posted way back in the first update. Now, I could have cut the intro clip at the title card. That's actually quite a natural place to end it. But I chose to keep recording into the resurrection sequence. At the time, I compared that scene to the intro to the $6 Million Man. Let's look again, particularly at Miranda's voiceover. What she says is kind of similar to what the narrator says in the $6 Million Man intro. Commander Shepard has been recovered. The Lazarus Project will proceed as planned. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. But where the two differ, where Miranda stops and the $6 Million Man keeps going, is the most famous bit. Better, stronger, faster. In Mass Effect 2, Miranda doesn't say that. If you talk to Miranda and the Elusive Man about why they haven't just implanted a control chip into Shepard's head, they tell you that they wanted to bring you back exactly as you were. They couldn't risk altering your character in any way because it might make you less capable, less of a hero. I think that's very telling. What's being said here is that Shepard's hero's journey was completed in Mass Effect 1. Shepard's battle against Sovereign and Saren, the Prothean cipher, his entanglement with Liara, that covers the whole development arc. Shepard doesn't develop much more, or at all, in the other two games, because their development is complete. This isn't just an accident of writing though, I think it is intentional, as Miranda's comments highlight. Shepard has become a Buddhist arhat, achieved a high level of enlightenment, and now returns from death to the waking world in order to guide it towards a higher state of being. That's how Shepard can be this transformative and transcendental figure that defies death, switches loyalty between the Alliance and Cerberus, heals their friends, and fixes the galaxy's greatest problems. In a way, Miranda's character is a rejection of the purely physical and the purely literal in favour of the spiritual and metaphorical. Miranda may be genetically superior to Shepard, but she'll never be their equal as long as she lacks Shepard's spiritual strength.
I don't have a public name, and the Hanar will go to ground if I make a formal inquiry.
So we're hunting.
I'm tracking suspicious transmissions to the Hanar homeworld. I could use your help.
Let me see what I can dig up at the Spectre office.
Thanks, Shepard. And for the record, not everyone doubted your concerns about the Reapers. I just hope we're not too late.
So, remember when you helped me get KG's grey box from Donovan Hawk?
Unlike our encounter with Miranda, this mission here is actually Kasumi's Spotlight mission. It's also awful. Whereas Mordin, Thane and Miranda get big juicy parts in the critical plotline, and Grunt and Jack get nice side quests all of their own, Kasumi and Saeed have these rather short and pitiful mini-quests in the Citadel hub, befitting their status as optional DLC characters, I suppose. Kasumi's mini-quest is fairly unengaging. Walk around the Citadel, hitting buttons and listening to characters talk until the quest ends. There's some variation in how exactly it ends, depending on Kasumi's loyalty in Mass Effect 2, which affects some minor war assets, but nothing majorly important. And that's pretty much the problem. We're dealing with some big, galaxy-shaking crises in this game. The Genophage, Cerberus, the Reapers. And this story about, well, let's be honest, one of Mass Effect's joke races, well, it just doesn't cut it. It's just not interesting. In fact, it's actively dull. As mentioned, the mission itself is boring to play, and in a similar complaint to Vega's sparring scene on the Normandy, the explanation just feels too torturous to feel natural. We can make almost the exact same complaints about Zaid's mission, which is something to do with a Volus ambassador selling Turian secrets to Cerberus, who then gets captured by anti-Cerberus mercenaries, one of whom is Zaid, so Shepard walks around tracking down the Volus and his kidnappers while liaising with Zaid, who kills the other mercenaries so you can rescue this traitor Volus, who repays you by forcing you to choose between getting the help of the Volus bomber fleet and saving a Turian colony. God, it's a mess. As I understand it, Both missions are hasty rewrites of the larger proper missions that were originally planned for both characters. To be honest though, my main criticism is that maybe we don't actually need to see Zaid and Kasumi again. It's a big galaxy out there, and constantly bumping into the same few characters all of the time does make it seem very small. Worse though is that it feels like very mechanical writing. BioWare has written these missions for Kasumi and Zaid not because they feel they have something they want to say with these characters, but because they need to tick boxes on the checklist. Zaid gets a mission not because there's an idea or feeling to convey with a hard-bitten mercenary, but because they need a Zaid mission to please the Zaid fans. There's a mission about the Hanar homeworld not because there's something meaningful that can be said here, but because BioWare needs to prove that they've showed what the Hanar are doing in Mass Effect 3. There's a mission with Conrad Werner, a confrontation with Khaleesi Al-Jalani, a mission with Balak the Batarian, an encounter with Matriarch Atheta. Some of these are fine. I like the Balak mission, and the complete version of Conrad Werner's mission kind of satirises this tendency for BioWare to reference even the most minute details. But others are somewhat lacking. I feel like if BioWare couldn't find anything interesting to do with these characters, then maybe it would have been better to just let them lie. Let the fans ask questions about what happens to Kasumi or what the Volus do. I mean, I'm a big believer in the economy of storytelling, but I think Chekhov's gun is overused and misused as a criticism. Not every plot thread has to be completely tied off with a bow. In fairness to BioWare, the unstated aim of Mass Effect 3 is to tie off all remaining threads from the previous games, hence all the guest star appearances by former party members. And as I suggested earlier, there'd probably be an outcry if they left anyone out. However, I reckon if you're expending so much effort to reintroduce and justify including all these old storylines, then you might just be better off leaving them alone. Let Kasumi disappear back into the underworld. Let the Hanar merge into the background. Is putting them in the spotlight, even for a mini-quest like this, really worth the hassle?
Got it. Upload's disabled. Looks like we're in the... Wait. He's got some kind of failsafe. Get down!
She was here the entire time.
She was an old friend.
I intended to arrest her.
She helped me take down the Collectors, and she just gave her life to save the Hanar homeworld.
Point taken. It was an honor to work with you, Shepard. When the time comes, I'll be there to return the favor, with a few friends.
You can come out now.
How'd you know?
Lucky guess.
There's no way you're recruiting me to fight in a galactic war.
The Crucible Project needs technical experts.
I'm not a scientist.
No, but you're the best thief in the galaxy, and you can hack unfamiliar technology better than anyone. They could use your help. And think of it. All that expensive tech just lying around. It's not like they're gonna check your pockets at the end of the project.
You say the nicest things. All right. I'm in. And Shep. Nice working with you again.
It's tempting to lay the blame entirely on BioWare, and to a certain extent that's true. BioWare's writers aren't the most rigorous out there. But, not that I particularly want to dig this old argument up again, I think part of the blame lies on the audience and their desire to be pandered to, perhaps against their better judgment. Back in 2006, Joshua Sawyer called CRPG players out on this in a comment on the Obsidian forums about how CRPG romances are almost always shallow, masturbatory ego-stroking fantasies. Characters are reduced to outlets for sexual fantasies and power trips, where if you talk to a character enough times and make the correct choices, you are rewarded with sex. Not even the experience of sex. Your character doesn't have sex, but instead through a tasteful fade to black, is blessed with the status of having had sex without any of the messy stuff in between. Negative consequences are rare and without permanence. The player is free to indulge their sexual fantasies without recrimination, and will almost always meet with success in their chosen relationship. No romance ever ends because the people involved discover that they're incompatible, or outside forces pull them apart, or the relationship just winds down to a natural end. The player always gets what they want. Sawyer thinks this sort of thing is something we need to move beyond. It's a very immature way to handle romance. BioWare writer and perpetual child Patrick Weeks disagreed with Sawyer in a poorly considered whiny and rather sexist response on the RPG Watch forums. As you probably have already guessed, I side with Sawyer in this argument. As I've said before, I have little patience for indulging an audience's emotional needs to such an extent. I think I've already mentioned the romance in the Prince of Persia 2008 game between the Prince and Elika as one that I like. I'll also freely admit to watching Farscape back when it aired 10 years ago or so, in part because of the romance between John Crichton and Aaron Sun. These are two very different romances, but one thing that they share is that they are not, primarily at least, aimed at indulging the audience, cosseting them and giving them exactly what they want all of the time. They stand apart and say their own thing. Now this is all rather heavy stuff for the Cortez romance. I don't mean to dump all this criticism on one of the only two gay male romances in the series, but it does quite strongly follow this writing model where it's all about fulfilling the player's needs over communicating anything valuable or meaningful. It's hilarious how many chances you get to clearly state that you aren't gay and you aren't interested in this relationship. Cortez is largely passive in this courtship because it wouldn't do to have a gay man hit on our player character. And I suppose if there's a coherent thread to this update, then that's probably it. For me, BioWare's writing is strongest when they have a clear idea of what they want to say and say it. The weaker parts are the parts where they forget about their own ideas and just try to indulge the audience's dullest desires. The jokes that have an actual structure to them are funny, the jokes that rely on referring to other, funnier occasions aren't. The character appearances that develop or conclude concepts and ideas are interesting, the appearances that just tick a box aren't. Romances that reflect a plausible relationship are meaningful. Romances that cater to player fantasies of sex or companionship aren't. This is going to be reflected in my analysis of Mass Effect 3 as a whole. The parts where BioWare is trying to make a statement are the parts where there's lots to say, whereas the parts where BioWare is just writing wish fulfillment are the parts where there's not much to say beyond I liked it or I disliked it. And that is a far greater writing sin than anything else I can imagine.
James, I've got some time if you want to talk privately.
On my way.
Hey man, how's it going? Good, James. You?
Good.
And finally, back to James Vega. Each of the party companions has one of these interactions with Shepard. We saw Liara's scene back in the video where we met Jarvik. That's probably the best one. Garrus's was earlier in the video and it was pretty funny, even if the last line sours it. Plus it's nice to flesh out these characters and see what comes out when they're not on a mission. This one is Vega's.
Things on my mind. I wanted to get your opinion on something.
Shoot.
What did you do when they asked you to join the N7 program? I mean, was it a no-brainer for you, or did you think about it before accepting?
The N7 program is a big deal, but it's also a big commitment.
I hear that.
You get the best training, best equipment, best assignments.
And they expect the best in return.
Yes, they do. Why you asking?
Well, even all the shit that's going on, somebody somewhere managed to track me down and forward an N7 commendation. It's dated the same day the Reapers attacked Earth.
It's unfortunate because it's marred again by Vega's overcomplicated backstory. It doesn't even really make sense. Cerberus was working against the Collectors, not for them. Plus, the stakes are really low. The N7 program is defunct. Vega can't receive any training, so it doesn't really make any difference either way whether he accepts or declines. It's hard to care about, especially since Vega is already a newcomer in a game full of established friends and enemies. But what it does do is mark the turnaround in Vega and Shepard's relationship. Vega finally eases off needling his commanding officer about being out of touch, out of shape or whatever. He finally accepts Shepard's wisdom for what it is. Finally sees Shepard as this agent for positive change. It's hard to see though. Vega's less direct with his issues than EDI is, for example, and players are far more likely to be interested in old friends Garrus and Liara than the new guy with a big mouth. Vega accepting Shepard as this mentor figure, as a father figure, just as Anderson was to Shepard all the way back at the beginning of Mass Effect 1, just gets lost in all the commotion, especially since many of the other characters have similar relationships to Shepard already. Which is a shame, because Vega's development speaks deeply to some of the core themes of the game.
I don't know. I don't think so.
The right choice is usually not the easy one.
Yeah. Did you know that before you joined the N7?
Yeah. That's why I was asked. And it's why they asked you. There's not a single N7 that hasn't sacrificed, either themselves or their soldiers at some point.
So you think I should accept?
Only you can make that decision, James. But I think you already know the answer.
I'm glad you think so. If you don't mind, maybe don't mention this to anyone else.
Of course.
I think one way BioWare could have developed it a bit more, and maybe brought it out into the forefront more, would have been to let players actively shape Vega. Kind of like what you could do with Garrus, Ashley and Kaiden in Mass Effect 1, guiding them towards Paragon or Renegade, except without having to dovetail them at the end, so that the different stories would match up for the sequel.
Well, after our little chat, I made up my mind. I'm gonna join the N7 program.
And you're celebrating by getting a tattoo?
Sort of. See, there's no official channels to go through right now. So, I guess this is my way of making it official. Technically, I'm just an N7 recruit, but, you know, I figure with you as my training officer, how could I fail? Right?
I'm flattered, but I wouldn't exactly say I'm training you.
Not officially, but what the hell is in this goddamn war? I'm just saying, whether you like it or not, you're my direct superior, and you're N7. So I take my lead from you. And you know, I'll take whatever advice you got.
Really?
Sure. The good advice.
Well, they wouldn't ask you if they didn't think you could handle it.
Maybe by making Vega more eager to ask questions about why Shepard does what they do, perhaps in the form of challenging Shepard to justify themselves, then Vega might become a more engaging character. It'd make the metaphor more obvious, it'd make interactions with him more interesting, and by creating this continuity of ideology with a character in the game, it might soften the blow of the ending when Shepard eventually dies. Oops. Spoilers.